The dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the attic window, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as I climbed the creaky wooden steps. Mom had been gone for 3 months now, and I'd finally worked up the courage to sort through her belongings. The attic smelled of old wood and forgotten memories, that particular scent that seems to cling to places where time stands still. I'd been putting this off for weeks, knowing that every box I opened would bring another wave of grief, another reminder that she was really gone. But the house needed to be cleared, and as the older sister, the responsibility fell to me. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the first cardboard box, labeled in Mom's familiar handwriting, Jessica's Things, 1987. My heart skipped a beat when I saw my name written in her careful script. I couldn't remember leaving anything here from 1987. That was the year everything changed, the year I tried so hard to forget, the year I was 17 and made the biggest mistake of my life. I set the box down gently on the dusty floorboards and lifted the lid with trembling fingers. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed tissue paper, I found things I thought were lost forever. My old diary with its tiny brass lock, a pressed flower from my senior prom corsage, and a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The sight of those letters made my breath catch in my throat because I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was mine, but these weren't letters I remembered writing. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, the kind Mom used for special occasions, and each envelope was addressed in my teenage handwriting to someone I'd tried to forget. I untied the ribbon with shaking hands, my mind racing back to that terrible summer when my world fell apart. The first letter was dated June 15, 1987, just 2 weeks after my high school graduation. "My dearest Brian," it began, and suddenly I was 17 again, sitting in this very attic, pouring my heart out to the boy who had promised to love me forever. The boy who had disappeared when I needed him most. I could barely focus on the words through the tears that were already forming, but I forced myself to read on. "I know you said you needed time to think, but I can't wait any longer to tell you. I'm pregnant, Brian. I'm carrying our baby, and I'm scared and alone, and I don't know what to do." The letter went on for 3 pages, filled with the desperate pleas of a teenage girl who thought love could conquer anything. But it was the second letter that made my blood run cold. This one was dated 2 months later, and the tone was completely different. "I've made my decision," I had written in careful, measured words that seemed too mature for my 17-year-old self. "The baby will be better off with someone who can provide a stable home. I've arranged everything through the adoption agency, and by the time you read this, it will all be over. Please don't try to find me. Please don't try to find our child. Some things are better left in the past." I stared at those words, my mind reeling because I had no memory of writing them. I remembered the pregnancy, remembered the fear and the shame, but I remembered giving birth to a stillborn baby. That's what everyone told me. That's what I believed for 35 years. The letter slipped from my numb fingers and fluttered to the floor like a dying bird. The third letter was the one that shattered my world completely. It was addressed to my sister Sarah, and it was in Mom's handwriting, not mine. "My dear Sarah," it read, "Jessica can never know the truth about what happened. The baby survived, and he's healthy and perfect, but she's been through enough trauma. The doctors say she may never be able to have children again after the complications during delivery. I've arranged for you to adopt him privately. You and Tom have been trying for so long, and this seems like God's way of answering everyone's prayers. Jessica believes the baby died, and it's better that way. She can move on with her life, go to college, make something of herself. You'll give the child the love and stability he deserves. Promise me you'll never tell her. Promise me you'll raise him as your own and never let him know the truth." The letter was dated August 30th, 1987, just 3 days after I thought I had buried my child. My legs gave out beneath me, and I sank to the dusty floor, clutching the letter to my chest as sobs racked my body. Sarah's son, Michael. The nephew I'd watched grow up from a distance, the boy who had my eyes and my stubborn chin, the child I'd always felt an inexplicable connection to. He was 35 years old now, married with children of his own, living just 20 minutes away in downtown Florence. I'd seen him at every family gathering, every holiday, every birthday party, and I'd never known. Sarah had never said a word. For 35 years, she'd looked me in the eye and lied, letting me believe my child was dead while she raised him as her own. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced, a wound that seemed to slice through my very soul. How could she have done this? How could Mom have orchestrated such an elaborate deception? I don't know how long I sat there on that attic floor, surrounded by the debris of my shattered life. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the room, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sounds of normal life continuing. Cars passing on the street below, children playing in neighboring yards, the world spinning on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my past, about the grief I'd carried for more than 3 decades, was a lie. I thought about all the times I'd comforted Sarah during her supposed fertility struggles, all the times I'd celebrated Michael's achievements with genuine joy, never knowing I was celebrating my own son's successes. The irony was so cruel, it was almost laughable, except I couldn't imagine ever laughing again. As the shadows lengthened and the attic grew dim, I carefully gathered the letters and placed them back in the box. My hands moved mechanically, my mind still reeling from the revelations. I needed time to process this, time to figure out what to do with this devastating knowledge. Should I confront Sarah? Should I tell Michael the truth? Did I have the right to destroy the family he'd always known, the only parents he'd ever loved? The questions swirled in my head like a tornado, each one more impossible to answer than the last. But one thing was certain. I couldn't pretend I'd never found these letters. I couldn't go back to the comfortable ignorance I'd lived in for 35 years. The truth was out now, and it demanded action, demanded justice, demanded answers that I wasn't sure I was strong enough to hear. I drove home in a daze, the box of letters sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every familiar landmark along the route seemed foreign and strange, as if I was seeing my hometown through completely different eyes. The tree-lined streets of Florence that had always felt like home now felt like a stage set for an elaborate lie. I kept glancing at the box, half convinced that when I got home and opened it again, the letters would say something different, that this was all some terrible nightmare I'd wake up from. But the weight of the cardboard box was real, the faded ink was real, and the crushing pain in my chest was all too real. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for another 10 minutes, staring at my modest 2-bedroom house and wondering how I was supposed to walk through that front door and pretend my world hadn't just imploded. Inside, I set the box on my kitchen table and stared at it while I made coffee with shaking hands. The familiar ritual of grinding beans and measuring water felt surreal, like I was watching someone else go through the motions of normal life. How do you make coffee when you've just discovered your dead child is alive? How do you function when everything you've believed for 35 years turns out to be a carefully constructed lie? I thought about calling in sick to work tomorrow, maybe for the rest of the week. But how do you explain to your boss that you need time off because your family has been lying to you for decades? The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling the silence with its familiar sounds. But even that comfort felt hollow now. Everything felt hollow, like I was living in a house of cards that had just collapsed around me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Sarah's number, my finger hovering over the call button. What would I even say? Hey sis, just found some interesting letters in Mom's attic. Want to explain why you've been raising my son for 35 years? The casual tone felt obscene given the magnitude of her betrayal. I set the phone down and picked up one of the letters instead, reading it again to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. But the words were clear, the dates were clear, and the handwriting was unmistakably Mom's careful script. There was no room for misinterpretation, no way to soften the brutal truth. Sarah had taken my baby and let me believe he was dead. Mom had orchestrated the whole thing, and I had been living a lie for more than half my life, mourning a child who was alive and well and calling another woman Mom. The coffee was ready, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. Instead, I found myself thinking about Michael, really thinking about him for the first time as my son rather than my nephew. I remembered the day Sarah brought him home from the adoption agency, how proud she and Tom had been, how grateful they'd seemed to finally have the child they'd been trying for. I remembered holding him for the first time, feeling an instant connection that I'd attributed to being his aunt. The way he'd gripped my finger with his tiny hand, the way he'd stopped crying when I held him, the way he'd always seemed to seek me out at family gatherings, even as a toddler. I'd thought it was just a special aunt-nephew bond, but now I understood it was something much deeper, something primal and biological that couldn't be explained away. He was my flesh and blood, and some part of me had always known it, even when my conscious mind refused to acknowledge the truth. I thought about all the milestones I'd witnessed from the sidelines. His first steps, his first words, his first day of school, his graduation, his wedding. I'd been there for all of it, but as an observer, not as his mother. Sarah had gotten to experience all the joys of motherhood that should have been mine, while I'd carried the grief of losing a child for 35 years. The unfairness of it was staggering, the cruelty almost beyond comprehension. How many nights had I cried myself to sleep, wondering what my child would have looked like, what kind of person he would have become. How many times had I avoided baby showers and children's birthday parties because the pain was too much to bear. Meanwhile, my son was growing up 20 minutes away, and I was missing everything because of a lie my own family had told me. The anger hit me like a physical force, so sudden and intense that I had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to keep from falling. How dare they? How dare Mom and Sarah make that decision for me? I was 17, yes, but I was old enough to choose what happened to my own child. I was old enough to decide whether to keep him or give him up for adoption. Instead, they'd taken that choice away from me, stolen my child, and condemned me to a lifetime of unnecessary grief. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about the initial deception. This was about 35 years of lies, 35 years of watching Sarah play the role of mother to my son, while I played the role of the grieving woman who couldn't have children. Every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every casual conversation about Michael's achievements had been a performance, a carefully maintained fiction that everyone was in on except me. I grabbed my laptop and opened a new browser window, my fingers flying over the keyboard as I searched for DNA testing services. If I was going to confront Sarah with this, I needed proof. I needed scientific evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. The letters were damning, but they were old, and Sarah might try to claim they were some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. A DNA test would be irrefutable. I found a service that promised results in just 5 days, and I placed an order for 2 kits, one for me and one for Michael. The hard part would be getting a sample from him without arousing suspicion, but I'd figure that out later. Right now, I just needed to take action, to do something concrete that would move me toward the truth. The waiting was killing me, the uncertainty eating away at my sanity like acid. As I closed the laptop, I caught sight of my reflection in the dark window above the sink. I looked older than my 52 years, worn down by decades of grief I should never have had to carry. My hair was graying at the temples, my face lined with the kind of deep sadness that comes from believing you've lost the most precious thing in the world. But now I knew the truth. I hadn't lost anything. It had been stolen from me, hidden from me, kept just out of reach while I suffered in ignorance. The woman staring back at me from the window looked like a stranger, someone whose entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of tearing down that foundation and building something new on the truth, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how many relationships it destroyed. Because living a lie, I realized, was worse than living with any truth, no matter how painful. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly as I sat at my kitchen table with the DNA test kit spread out before me. The instructions seemed simple enough, just a cheek swab and a few forms to fill out, but my hands shook as I read through the paperwork. This felt like crossing a line I could never uncross, taking a step that would either confirm my worst fears or prove that I was losing my mind. Part of me hoped the test would come back negative, that the letters were some kind of elaborate mistake, that I could go back to my quiet life of manageable grief instead of this consuming rage and confusion. But deep down, I knew what the results would show. The resemblance between Michael and me wasn't just my imagination. It was genetics, pure and simple, written in our shared DNA and visible to anyone who cared to look closely enough. I called in sick to work, claiming a stomach bug, which wasn't entirely untrue. The thought of sitting through meetings and pretending to care about quarterly reports when my entire world had been turned upside down seemed impossible. Instead, I spent the morning researching everything I could about private adoptions in Alabama in 1987, trying to understand how Mom and Sarah could have pulled off such an elaborate deception. What I found made my blood run cold. Back then, private adoptions were much less regulated, and with the right connections and enough money, almost anything was possible. Mom had worked as a nurse at Florence General Hospital for 30 years. She would have known doctors, social workers, people who could help arrange things quietly. The more I learned, the more I realized how carefully orchestrated this whole thing had been. By noon, I couldn't stand being alone with my thoughts any longer. I needed to see Michael, to look at him with fresh eyes and confirm what I already knew in my heart. I drove to his office downtown, my palms sweating as I gripped the steering wheel. He worked as an architect for a small firm that specialized in historic renovations. Ironic, considering how much of his own history had been renovated and rewritten. I'd visited him at work before, usually around the holidays to drop off gifts for his kids, so my appearance wouldn't seem too unusual. But this time felt different. This time, I wasn't visiting my nephew. I was seeing my son for the first time, really seeing him, and the weight of that knowledge made every breath feel labored and difficult. The receptionist smiled and waved me back to his office, where I found Michael hunched over his drafting table, working on blueprints for what looked like a Victorian house restoration. He looked up when I knocked on his doorframe, and his face broke into that familiar warm smile that had always made my heart skip a beat. Now I knew why. It was my smile, the same slightly crooked grin I saw in old photos of myself at his age. His eyes were my eyes too, that unusual shade of green gold that people always commented on. How had no one else noticed? How had I spent 35 years looking at my own features reflected in his face and never questioned it? The resemblance was so obvious now that I wondered if I'd been willfully blind, or if the grief and trauma had somehow blocked my ability to see what was right in front of me. "Aunt Jess," he said, standing up to give me a hug. The word aunt hit me like a physical blow, and I had to fight back tears as his arms wrapped around me. He smelled like coffee and the faint scent of the cologne his wife had given him for Christmas, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would have been like to hug him as his mother, to have been the one he called when he got his first job, when he met the woman he wanted to marry, when his children were born. The life I'd been cheated out of stretched before me like a road I'd never been allowed to travel, and the loss felt fresh and raw, as if it had happened yesterday instead of 35 years ago. I held him a little longer than usual, memorizing the feeling of my son in my arms, even if he didn't know that's what he was. "I was just in the neighborhood," I lied, pulling back and trying to compose myself. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing. How are Emma and the kids?" We made small talk for a few minutes, and I found myself studying every gesture, every expression, looking for more evidence of our connection. The way he ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking was exactly what I did. The way he tilted his head when he listened was a mirror image of my own mannerisms. Even his laugh was familiar, not just because I'd heard it at family gatherings for decades, but because it was my laugh, the same slightly snorting sound that had embarrassed me as a teenager. Every similarity felt like another piece of evidence, another confirmation that the letters hadn't lied. This man, this wonderful, successful, happy man, was my son, and I'd missed his entire life because of my family's betrayal. When he offered me coffee, I saw my chance. While he was in the break room, I quickly swabbed the inside of his coffee mug with the DNA collection kit I'd brought in my purse. My heart pounded so hard I was sure everyone in the office could hear it, but I managed to get a good sample and seal it in the provided container before he returned. The deception felt wrong. He deserved to know what I was doing and why, but I needed proof before I could blow up his world the way mine had been blown up. If the test came back positive, I'd tell him everything. If it came back negative, I'd find a way to live with the uncertainty and never mention any of this to anyone. But as I looked at him sipping his coffee and telling me about his daughter's soccer game, I knew with absolute certainty what the results would show. The drive home felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept thinking about the sample in my purse, the tiny piece of evidence that would either confirm or deny the most important question I'd ever asked. That evening, I packaged both samples and drove to the FedEx office, my hands trembling as I filled out the shipping labels. 5 days, they'd said. 5 days until I had scientific proof of what my heart already knew. 5 days to figure out how to tell my son that his entire life had been built on a lie. that the woman he called Mom had stolen him from his real mother, that the aunt who'd always seemed to care a little too much was actually the woman who'd given him life. As I watched the packages disappear into the shipping container, I felt like I was sending my future into the unknown, trusting strangers in a laboratory to confirm or deny the most important truth of my life. The next 5 days passed like a slow-motion nightmare. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the phone calls and emails I was waiting for. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, thinking it might be the DNA results, only to find spam calls or work emails that seemed completely irrelevant to my new reality. I'd taken the entire week off work, claiming I had the flu, and spent my days pacing around my house like a caged animal, alternating between desperate hope and crushing dread. What if the test was negative? What if I'd been wrong about everything, and the letters were some kind of cruel joke or misunderstanding? But then I'd remember Michael's face, the way he'd looked at me with those eyes that were so clearly my own, and I'd know that no test could change what I felt in my bones. On Wednesday, 3 days into my wait, Sarah called. "Hey, Jess," she said in that casual tone that now sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. "I haven't heard from you since Mom's funeral. How are you holding up?" The irony of her asking how I was holding up, when she was the reason I was falling apart, almost made me laugh. Instead, I gripped the phone so tightly, my knuckles went white, and forced myself to sound normal. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just been busy cleaning out Mom's house." There was a pause, and I wondered if she could hear the strain in my voice, if she suspected that I'd found something in that attic that would change everything. "Do you need any help with that?" she asked, and I could hear something in her tone. Concern, maybe, or fear. "No," I said quickly. "I've got it handled." We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, and the whole time I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, to ask her how she'd lived with herself all these years. Thursday night, I couldn't stand the waiting anymore. I drove past Michael's house, a modest 2-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood where children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns and porch lights glowed warmly in the darkness. I could see him through the living room window, helping his daughter with what looked like homework while his wife folded laundry on the couch. They looked like the perfect family, happy and content, and completely unaware that their world might be about to change forever. I sat in my car across the street for almost an hour, watching this scene of domestic bliss and wondering if I had the right to destroy it. Michael had good parents. Sarah and Tom had raised him well, loved him, given him everything he needed to become the man he was today. Did it matter that they weren't his biological parents? Did it matter that I was the one who'd carried him for 9 months, who'd given birth to him in pain and terror, who'd grieved for him for 35 years? Friday morning, the call finally came. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the box of letters for what felt like the 1,000th time, when my phone rang with an unknown number. "Ms. Jessica Morrison?" the voice on the other end asked. "This is Dr. Patricia Williams from GeneTech Laboratories. I'm calling with your DNA test results." My heart stopped beating for what felt like a full minute. "Yes," I managed to whisper. "I'm ready." There was a rustling of papers, and then Dr. Williams spoke the words that changed my life forever. "The test shows a 99.97% probability that you and the second sample are parent and child. Congratulations, Ms. Morrison. You have a biological son." The phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered to the floor, and I heard Dr. Williams' voice calling my name from far away, asking if I was still there, if I needed her to repeat the results. I don't remember picking up the phone or ending the call. I don't remember the next hour at all, actually. When I finally came back to myself, I was sitting on my bathroom floor, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. 35 years of grief, 35 years of believing my child was dead, 35 years of carrying a pain so deep it had shaped every decision I'd made since I was 17 years old, and it had all been for nothing. My son was alive. My son was healthy and happy and successful, and he was living 20 minutes away from me, and I'd missed his entire life because my own family had lied to me. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, like someone had reached into my chest and torn out my heart with their bare hands. How could they have done this to me? How could they have let me suffer for so long when a simple truth would have changed everything? But underneath the pain and the rage, there was something else. A fierce, overwhelming joy that I'd never expected to feel again. My baby was alive. The child I'd mourned for more than half my life was walking around in the world, breathing and laughing and living a full life. He had children of his own now, a wife who loved him, a career he was passionate about. He was everything I'd ever hoped he might become, and more. The fact that I'd missed watching him grow up was a tragedy I'd never get over. But the fact that he'd grown up at all was a miracle I'd never stopped hoping for, even when hope seemed impossible. For the first time in 35 years, the future looked different. For the first time since I was 17, I had a son again. I called in sick for another week, knowing I couldn't face the normal world until I'd figured out what to do with this devastating knowledge. The test results sat on my kitchen table next to the letters, two pieces of evidence that proved beyond any doubt that my entire life had been built on a lie. I had a son. Sarah had stolen him from me. Mom had orchestrated the whole thing, and now I had to decide what to do about it. Should I confront Sarah first, demand an explanation for 35 years of deception? Should I go straight to Michael and tell him the truth, regardless of how it might destroy the family he'd always known? Should I contact a lawyer, see if there were any legal remedies for what had been done to me? The questions swirled in my head like a tornado, each one more impossible to answer than the last. That night, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and stared at the photo on my mantel, a family picture from last Christmas, all of us gathered around Mom's tree, smiling and laughing like we didn't have a care in the world. Sarah had her arm around Michael, and he was holding his youngest daughter, and I was standing off to the side with that slightly sad smile I'd perfected over the years. Looking at it now, I could see the truth written in our faces, the way Michael's features echoed mine, the way Sarah's smile seemed just a little too bright, the way Mom's eyes held secrets she'd never shared. How many people had known? How many family members and friends had been in on the deception? How many times had people looked at Michael and me together and wondered why no one ever mentioned the obvious resemblance? The photo that had once brought me comfort now felt like evidence of a conspiracy, proof that I'd been living in a carefully constructed fantasy, while everyone around me knew the truth. The confrontation with Sarah happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after I'd found the letters. I drove to her house with the DNA results and the letters in a manila envelope, my hands steady for the first time in days, because I finally knew what I had to do. When she opened the door, her face went pale the moment she saw my expression, and I knew that she knew. "We need to talk," I said, pushing past her into the living room where Michael had taken his first steps, where he'd opened Christmas presents for 35 years, where Sarah had played the role of mother to my stolen son. I set the envelope on her coffee table and watched her stare at it like it might explode. "Jessica, I can explain," she started, but I held up my hand to stop her. The DNA test results spoke louder than any explanation she could offer, and the letters in Mom's handwriting were proof of a conspiracy that had stolen 35 years of my life. "He's my son," I said, my voice surprisingly calm despite the storm raging inside me. "Michael is my son, and you've known it all along." Sarah's face crumpled, and she sank into her chair like a deflated balloon, finally dropping the mask she'd worn for more than 3 decades. The silence stretched between us, filled with 35 years of lies, 35 years of stolen moments, 35 years of a grief I should never have had to carry. "I'm going to tell him the truth," I said, standing up and taking the envelope with me. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy for her. She'd made her choice 35 years ago, and now she'd have to live with the consequences. "Please," she whispered, "think about what this will do to him, to his children, to our family." But I was done thinking about everyone else's feelings, while my own had been ignored for decades. "You should have thought about that before you stole my baby," I replied, walking toward the door. As I drove away, I could see her in my rearview mirror, standing in her doorway like a woman watching her world collapse, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt something that might have been peace.